Hey everybody, today I'm talking about Torres, which is a board game that was originally released in the year 1999 and actually won the Spiel des Jahres in the year 2000. This one is designed by Wolfgang, Kramer and Michael Kiesling. It accommodates 2 to 4 players and takes around 60 minutes to play. Now Torres is considered almost a sister game to the Mask trilogy of games, which included Mexica, Java and Tikal. And this one has a lot of similarities to those games, as essentially you are trying to expand these castles. You're trying to not only increase their kind of footprint, but also trying to build them upwards. You've got your little knights here and you're trying to basically dominate these towers to get as many points as possible. Now, a bit like Mexica, this one uses the action points allowance mechanism, where from turn to turn you're going to have 5 actions to spend how you wish. I've advanced the game state here somewhat just so I can give some examples about how the game works and to give you a clearer example how you're actually going to score these castles when it comes to scoring. So each game is going to be divided into 3 phases, are dictated by this card here, and from phase to phase you're going to get a number of castles at your disposal. So let's say I was here in the third round, let's say in the third phase, I'm going to have 2 stacks of 3 castles and a stack of 2 castles, and that basically also determines the amount of almost turns you get in each phase. So in the third phase I'm going to get 3 turns to spend these castles how I wish. So let's talk about all the different actions you can take by spending your action points. So individually, these actions are pretty simple and you can choose to split them how you like. You have got some limitations on what you can do. For example, you can't do certain things over and over again because the rules dictate that you can't do that. But let's talk about some of the simple ones. So for example, you could move this knight here for an action point. So the yellow player wants to go 1 action point, 2 action points. You can always jump up 1 level. So for an action point, I can jump up to here for 1 action point, and I can jump up to level 2 from an action point. However, I couldn't jump straight from the floor to a level 2 because that would be too far. Jumping off a building is only going to cost 1 action point. And also, if you want to go in a castle and come out the other side, you can actually spend a whole action point to do that one. So for example, I could go in this ground level of this castle here and come out here for a single action point. Another action you could do is to spawn a new knight. So for 2 action points, you can choose to spawn a knight orthogonally to one of your existing knights as long as it's on the same or a lower level. So I can do that for 2 action points. Of course, something you could do is to build new towers, and whenever you build a new level of a tower, it's going to cost you 1 action point for each level. So let's say, for example, I wanted to spend an action point here, so that cost me 1 and then 2. And maybe for a 3rd action point, I could do this one like this for 3, and then even spawn another new knight for 4 and 5 action points. So that would be an example of a turn. Now, there are also some restrictions on how to build these things. So for example, you could never build higher than the footprint of a castle. So, you know, this footprint of this particular castle only has 3. So I couldn't build a level 4 tower because I would have to expand further before doing so. Additionally, these castles can't ever connect to one another. You can go diagonally, but they can't actually end up, you know, perfectly connecting. And additionally, there's a bit of a strange rule where if you ever spend a certain amount of these castles, for example, I wanted to spend 2 action points on these ones. If I ever have like a lingering one by the end of my turn and I can't place it on one of my existing castles here at my disposal, then that one has to go back into the box. You can always just spend action points to get pure points, so your victory points. And to do that, for each action point you're going to spend is going to move you 1 up this track. So for example, I could spend 3 action points to do that. But if another player did the same thing and they got the same points as me, they would actually jump over me so that no players can ever share the exact same space. And the final thing you can spend your action points on is to draw these action cards. So every player is going to have their unique deck here, or their individual deck. They are all the same from player to player, but you're all going to have your own individual cards. And when you do that action, you're going to draw 3 cards. You're going to pick the one you want, and you're going to put the remaining cards either on the top or the bottom of the deck, however you see fit. Now, these action cards let you do lots of cool things that can break the rules of the game, such as being able to place towers directly where your knights already are. So I could spend, let's just say I spend this one here, and I could build directly where I'm already standing, which would normally not be the case. Or cards like this, for example, that would let you jump straight up to a level 2. So let's say this player wouldn't normally be able to do this because he'd have to go 1 level at a time. But if he played the action card, he can jump up straight there to kind of speed things up. So these cards aren't going to cost any action points to use them, just to draw them into your hand, and you can't actually use them on the turn you draw them. So let's take a look at how you actually score points in Torres. So at the end of each phase, you're going to evaluate each of your player pieces and score each castle individually. So let's just use this small castle here as an example. As you can see, this one has a footprint of 3 because it only is sprawling to 3 different squares. And then each player's piece is going to score depending on how high it is on each of these towers. So as you can see, the green player is only on level 2. So they're going to times the footprint, which is 3, by the level 2 they're on to get 6 points. The same is going to apply to the yellow, but because they're on level 3, they're going to have 3 times 3 for 9 points. And that's going to apply to all the different castles. So as you can probably tell, the bigger castles and the higher you are, you get bigger and bigger multipliers. There's also another way to score depending on where this king piece is. Now this king piece is going to score at the end of each phase. In the first phase, it's going to be worth 5 points. The second, it's going to be worth 10 points. And then in the third phase, it's going to be worth 15 points. And the way that's going to score is you're going to have a look at the castle where the king is. And if you have a knight on the same level in that castle, so for example, this blue piece is on level 2, the king is on level 2, that player is going to score the number of points equal to that round. So again, 5, 10 or 15 points. And from round to round, he's going to move from castle to castle, depending on who's furthest behind is going to decide where that king moves. And at the end of 3 phases, whoever's got the most victory points is going to be declared the winner. So generally, I tend to shy away from abstract style games because I always find them oddly unsatisfying and a bit unexciting, to be honest. However, there's a lot of things I do like about Torres. A lot of it is because of the dynamic board state. You know, things are constantly growing, not only spreading, but also growing upwards, which is really cool. You've got to map out your moves quite carefully, and you can actually make some pretty clever plays because, again, as the game develops, you can take some shortcuts, cutting through buildings. You're going to end up playing these cards to break rules and to get the advantage on your opponents. I also like mapping out how you're going to spend action points, and I would say that generally action points, from the general gist of things, that people think that's a bit of a dated mechanism. I tend to really enjoy that mechanism. I like how to map out how you're going to spend your actions, how you're going to make investments now. You know, are you going to invest in cards now to break things later? Because, you know, these aren't going to cost you action points if you do play these cards later. So you are making investments. You want to be making sure that you've got action points to jump around in terms of moving your knights up and not leave openings for your opponents, because if you constantly build things, you might just be laying a perfect foundation for your opponents to jump in there and snatch the spot that you intended for yourself, meaning that you have to divert your strategy and try build somewhere else to not only keep up with your opponents, but try to exceed them, because you'll often find that these castles, or particular castles, are growing strong, they're getting higher and higher, and you don't want your opponents to get the higher levels of those ones. Because once they're there, they're going to be pretty hard to get them off, and you're going to have to build alternate routes to take stepping stones to build up, because of course you can only ever jump up one space at a time. And all these things going on at the same time is great. You've got to know when to kind of cut your losses and know that you can't compete with someone because they are running away, and try to build somewhere else. You can spread yourself a bit thinner in terms of spending action points to put more knights down to jump in more castles to get points that way. Or are you going to consider just focusing on a particular castle and getting loads of points from a single castle that way? So there are constant decisions going on. The board state is constantly in flux, and you're going to have to not only focus on long-term strategy, but also be knowing when to react and know how to be tactical, and to basically be on the ball and know how you're going to squeeze each point out of the game by the time the phase ends. The management of these castle pieces is also pretty interesting, because you have got a limited supply. You can't just keep spamming things down. And that additional rule where you know, if you spend a certain amount of these castle pieces and you are left with a straggler, then if you haven't got somewhere to place for it, because you've only got a capacity of having 3 on each column, and you can't do that, for example, and keep it there, then you are going to lose them. So there is a small efficiency puzzle there that can actually be quite important the more you get down to the nitty-gritty with this game. As you would probably expect with an abstract game of this nature, the balance really does lie with the players. The game is perfectly balanced. It's almost perfect information, and you can see exactly what you're capable of and what your opponents are capable of. And it's about spinning those plates and being on the ball. However, these action cards do add a bit of spice to the game, add a bit of things to manipulate the board state and do things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. And for me, that is a real welcome addition, and it adds a lot of flavour and a lot of enjoyment for me. There are also different ways you can incorporate these cards, whether you want to have your own personal deck like I've explained, or whether you want to have one big jumbo deck and try to mix all those cards together and just get the lucky dip. Or you can even play the master variant where you have all your cards at your disposal from the start and it's up to you how you want to spend these action cards. And I would say the more you get into the game and you know these action cards and you understand what they can all do, that can add a lot of depth and really really can sing to somebody who likes those extremely deterministic games where you know exactly what your opponent's capable of at all times. So if you want that perfect information game, then you are more than welcome to play that way. As I said in the intro, the game does, or the box says that it takes 60 minutes to play. I would argue that it's a little bit faster than that. I would say you can comfortably play this one in about 45 minutes, which for me feels right. It certainly doesn't outstay its welcome, and these 3 phases do go by pretty rapidly, and the board does start to develop pretty rapidly as well. Each action, or each kind of player's turn, is obviously going to consist of 5 action points, sometimes more than that if they've got one of these cards at their disposal. And I will say there is some scope for analysis paralysis. You want to be making sure that you're not wasting your actions. And of course, you want to, well, a lot of the time you'll be finding players backtracking on their move as they've made wrong decisions. And of course, they don't want to be wasting their turns. But I will say that if you have, if you know what you're going to do on your turn and people haven't really encroached on you, then you can actually take your turns pretty rapidly, and turns do go by faster and faster the more you play this one. And for example, you could just smash 3 towers down, move your piece, and draw a card, and that's your turn done, and it can be straight on to the next player, ready to go on. So I wouldn't complain at all about downtime. I think it's pretty snappy, and the actual footprint and the actual timestamp of the game is pretty spot on for me. I would also say Torres is pretty versatile on who you could play this with, because the rules themselves are pretty simple, and it really is, well, it's an abstract style game. And I find those kind of games do well in catering for a lot of people. You know, I could more than happily see children play this game and enjoy it by playing against each other. Yes, if you're going to play it with a child and you're an adult, you are probably going to absolutely annihilate them. But the game, you know, that's not the game's fault. It really is a deterministic game with pretty clear information, and the framework just does a great job of giving you the platform to play what you want. You know, if you want to play the most strategic and errorless game that you want to play, then you can do that by playing someone at your own level, and it's going to be a real cutthroat competition. But again, kids are going to be able to play this breezily, or you could play this casually as well. So I do think it does a good job of catering to a wide market of people. I think the components of the game are pretty damn good, especially these castle pieces. You know, they snap together very nicely and they're quite satisfying in the way they work. I suppose they're this kind of like Bakelite plastic, but yeah, they do snap together nice. I would say that if you've got particularly big hands or you're a bit clumsy, then there is kind of scope for knocking the board and knocking things over, but it's usually an easy fix, and it's not like you're gonna just completely wipe the board out. These little knights are okay. They're a little bit unstable, and they're again easy to knock over, and I would like to have seen them have a bit more of a firmer base, particularly because the board has some particularly big creases in it, and if you wanted to put your player piece on this particular spot, then it's just going to fall over. So small critiques there, but overall I'm pretty happy with the production. You get a ton of pieces. The cards themselves are of good quality. The iconography is decent, but if you don't understand them straight away, there's a pretty good reference guide in the rules book. Player interaction is embedded in this game whether you like it or not. You're going to be constantly jostling for position, trying to get the best towers. People are going to be in your way because you can't share the same spot as someone else. You're going to be blocking them. You're going to be trying to make sure that you're way ahead on certain castles so people can't capitalize on your work. So player interaction is part and fundamental to the game really, and that's kind of unavoidable. So if you want to just do your own thing and ignore other players, then you're not going to get the most out of Torres. But if you do like those really interactive abstract games, then you are going to like Torres a lot. Replayability is also it's pretty decent because you are going to be reactive to the board state and you're going to be playing your opponent, but there are different ways to play the game, not only because of the the different ways you can play the cards, but there are also these almost end game objectives you can choose to play with should you want to. For example here, if you want to play with this card, at the end of the game, if you've got a knight on the ground floor, level 1, level 2, level 3 and level 4, then you're going to score a massive 40 victory points. And there's lots of different things like that, like by having people in certain spots or different things. So another little welcome element if you want to inject that part of the game. And there's different setups as well you can do. You can play the basic setup and go on the predetermined spaces, or you can even determine how you want to start based on basically taking turns and placing the castles wherever you want. So there is an element of variability there, but the more outweighing factor is the fact that it's more tactical and a dynamic style game. I think Torres scales pretty well. I would more happily play this one at the 3 or 4 player count because I think it's a bit more cutthroat. There's a lot more struggle for those higher positions on each castle, and you're going to be blocking each other more casually. Whereas in a 2 player game, it's going to be a lot more head to head, and probably more often than not, you're going to be doing your own thing and kind of cornering and just building a certain castle to get as high as you can and just capitalizing on what your other people are doing a bit more. Whereas in a 3 or 4 player game, it's going to be a bit more chaotic, which I think is going to be a good thing. And in comparison to other games out there, I've already mentioned Mexica, which uses the action point system. This one does do that as well, and it does strike a chord and kind of it does spark some familiarity with that game for me. But additionally, if you're familiar with a game called Santorini, this one has some pretty distinct similarities to that one as well, not only because you have almost a 3D element to the game as well, where you're trying to get your pieces higher and higher on these different castles, or in Santorini, of course, the buildings. But this one, I feel, has a bit more free reign to it. You've got that almost unlimited potential to build upwards, whereas in Santorini, you've got a glass ceiling on doing that one. And this one also scales a lot better than Santorini, so I would actually recommend this one a lot more than I would Santorini, even though I did enjoy that game. So overall, I actually really enjoyed Torres, and that's quite unusual because abstract games are something that I are usually just a bit, meh on. I usually think they're okay. But there's a lot of things about this game that I do enjoy. So, of course, the 3D element adds a lot of fun to the game and adds a lot to the table appeal. And I like the way that you are blocking people off, trying to find the best routes and get into these best castles. I also like the different ways you can play with these cards. Yeah, you can add that wild element into the game where you're just drawing cards off the top and picking the ones you want. But I do actually like the concept of having all the cards at your disposal to have a perfect information game. So I like the different ways you can play the game as well. And I would say that out of all the abstract games I've played, I can't really think of any more explicitly abstract games that I've enjoyed more than Torres. And I always find it very difficult to critique critique abstract games because rules-wise, there's nothing wrong with this game whatsoever. I can't criticize anything, and I can't say there's something that needs to be taken out of it or something that needs to be added into it, because they are so pure, and it usually is just a matter of taste. And I will say that as far as taste goes, this is definitely my favourite one that I've played, and certainly has the hallmark of a Kramer and Kiesling game. There are a lot of things you need to weigh up. There are things you can inject into the game, such as the end game objectives, and it's a very dynamic game. It's got a reactive element to it. It's got lots of different paths you can go down, as I said, spreading yourself thin, going in certain castles, knowing when to play cards, knowing when to make investments. And all of that is just adds into a fun, pretty succinct experience, which I find hard to criticise, and I find hard to give anything but my shield of quality, because I think it would be highly unjust to give this one any less than a 7 out of 10. And it certainly does hold up to that quality. So I enjoy it. It's going to stay in my collection, and I want to play this one with a lot of different people, and I want to try the different ways that you can play this game time and time again to see which method I prefer. But if you like your abstract games, this one is certainly one that's weathered the weather of time well. It's stood the test of time. It still feels fresh. It's pretty snappy. There's not too much AP, and I think you're going to really enjoy this 3D puzzle. So that concludes my thoughts on Torres. Definitely give this one a try if you like your abstracts. Definitely one of the best ones out there. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you have, please hit like and subscribe to my channel, and check out my other videos too. For everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye.